As a thanatologist, we always think that death is the hardest thing, and it is, right? As a thanatologist, okay. However, she did say that for people that are going through extremely high conflict divorces, like what we're talking about, she, in her professional opinion, would say it's harder than a death loss.
So if there is one partner that maintains that power within the relationship, one of the most effective mechanisms of control and abuse is by making the person who's being victimized or will eventually become survivor of that abuse is to make it all their fault. So if you need to cry, cry. If you feel like you need to scream into a pillow, do it. It's going to be very realistically an overwhelming swirl of emotions, and it won't be pleasant. And when you're being constantly tugged backwards, whether that's tugged back into court, tugged backwards because you are, trying to deal with finances, tugged back and forth because of custody issues, there's not really that break, that separation, ability to have space, time, and healing. It doesn't happen. One of the biggest aspects is that complex post-traumatic stress and the separate kind of symptoms that it has are very closely tied to poor self-worth and shame and judgment and a lot of the abusive dynamics people can experience. And that would be the same as if you're experiencing certain types of post-separation abuse. Make sure that you always have a safety plan, a safe exit, and even having cash or an extra cell phone, a friend that knows what you're going through. Safety first. So when we talk about poor self-worth and poor self-concept, when it comes from trauma, that is pretty deep and pretty dark. Having persistent anxiety can lead to things like chronic pain and other sorts of physical health issues that echo down the line.
Welcome to the Just Separated podcast. Hi, I'm Karen Oman, a thanatologist, grief counselor, divorce strategist, and co-author of the Just Separated workbook. I draw on years of personal and professional experience to guide you through the challenges of your divorce. Together, with our expert guests, we'll equip you with the clarity, resilience, and tools to take charge and move forward with confidence. Follow Just Separated and join us as we explore the many different facets of divorce. Hi, welcome to the Just Separated podcast. I'm your host, Karen Oman, co-founder of the Divorce Workshop. Today we're going to talk about divorce, trauma, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, when the pain doesn't end after it's over. And our expert guest is Sara Fischer Sanford. Sara is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified clinical trauma professional. Is a San Francisco-based psychotherapist specializing in complex trauma and recovery from interpersonal violence, including post-separation abuse. Sara brings deep clinical expertise and lived empathy to her work with adults navigating identity shifts, grief, and relational transitions. With a warm, grounded approach, Sara helps survivors move from self-blame to self-trust. Her practice centers on healing, clarity, and reclaiming a sense of personal power. Welcome, Sara, to the Just Separated podcast.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about this topic. It's very close to my heart as well as to my practice. So thank you.
Oh, it's going to be an awesome conversation. I just want to tell everybody that this conversation is just for educational purposes only, and it's not a substitute for therapy or mental health treatment. So the first thing I want to ask, Sara, is that I think a lot of people don't realize that they actually could be experiencing complex post-traumatic stress disorder after relationships ends or even in a marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it so hard to recognize for what it really is?
I think there's two main reasons that come to mind, and one may be more emotional and one is more practical. So I think one is just that we don't talk about, complex post-traumatic stress very often. I think that many people are more aware of and familiar with PTSD because it's just more discussed. And the symptoms, again, are slightly different. It's not something that we have a technical diagnosis 4 in our diagnostic manuals. So those of us that are working in mental health and billing insurance, even on that like practical level, without having a technical diagnosis in the book, in our manual, I think it can definitely kind of be overlooked. So those are some of the more like on the surface reasons I think that it gets overlooked. But then I also think that one of the biggest aspects is that complex post traumatic stress and the separate kind of symptoms that it has are very closely tied to poor self worth and shame and judgment and a lot of the abusive dynamics people can experience. So the likelihood of people to acknowledge that um, those are the things we keep the most close and most, dark symptoms under the surface. So I think between the more practical reasons and then those additional symptoms with the sort of the darkness to it, that comes together with it becoming very much under wraps in a way.
So would you say it's kind of a hidden? Like it's not really, since you say it's not well recognized, I was just thinking like in my own experience, when I
Hmm.
started digging deeper into my own leaving an abusive marriage and coming out of it, all the symptoms, and I want to talk about them, is I went, that was me, but I had no idea. So because there's such a lack of awareness, even the general population, it really hinders our ability to get support from you or from others, right?
Absolutely. Um, and I think that, something that we think about when we think about our bodies and our minds in general is that, in a way, like we are designed to be able to cope through trauma itself. We go through hard things, whether it's a car accident or a single event that may have a post-traumatic event, a stressor on us over time and just through natural coping, right? Most of us can get through a single event of trauma and come out the other side, without too much distress. But when we look at something that is complex, we're looking at not just a single incident like a car accident, but something such as within an abusive marriage or post separation abuse, right? Which is that abuse that appears after a separation, that it is prolonged multiple events of trauma. So when you combine all of that, then we add that layer on top of, prolonged events, poor self worth that typically accompanies that, often some social isolation, not a lot of talking about access to services or care or what this really is. And it's really like creating the perfect scenario where people can be experiencing all of these things and just start to go into a cycle of self blame rather than saying like, wow, I really do have this separate mental health concern that needs separate treatment. So it is definitely something that feeds on itself, and the person experiencing it copes poorly or internalizes or blames rather than says, okay, I need treatment.
So let's break down, like for some of our listeners, right? I want to talk about like what are the symptoms, because I think,
Hmm.
as I said to you before, when I started reading over them over these years, I've been doing my own healing journey as well. I'm like, oh my goodness, I had that one. I had that one. I tell many people, I've said on the podcast before, is that there were times I would lay in bed and I have a degree and I had a college diploma, and I would lay in bed and I would say, I don't even think I feel so worthy I could work at the local 7-Eleven. Like I had absolutely
Okay.
no self-esteem. And those are one of the stories I just wanted to point out, that how it affected me, the years of the chronic abuse, right? So
Hmm.
let's talk about some of the symptoms that you see with people so they can kind of maybe go, oh boy, that's me as well.
Okay. And so some of the symptoms are going to be sort of under that umbrella of PTSD. And then there's going to be the additional that come with complex. But I think to know that it's not one or the other. If you have complex post traumatic stress, it's usually all. So it is much more. It's not just that you are taking a separate set of symptoms, it's like you're doubling down. So when people experience PTSD, typical symptoms would be having what we call re experiencing. That is having flashbacks, nightmares, or having those intrusive thoughts, which can be almost like, nightmares when we are awake, that thoughts that of the past, of the trauma that just keep creeping in when we're trying to do other things. The avoidance would be avoiding the person that may have caused the trauma, avoiding scenarios or places that remind us of the trauma. That could be avoiding relationships. It could be avoiding a home where abuse existed, or other places that really remind us of the person that caused the trauma or the events themselves. Can be feeling on edge or tense. We hear that term hypervigilance, but for a lot of clients, that feels that walking on eggshells feeling, that even if you are still in a safe environment, without therapy, for a lot of people, we can't just turn that off. So that hypervigilant eggshell state starts to become more of the state we're living in, rather than living in a relaxed body. So those are some of the PTSD symptoms that are a big chunk of the complex trauma, but that are PTSD in itself. Now, when we start looking at complex trauma, we add, right? We're adding more symptoms. And some of that would include what we would fall under this category of emotional regulation difficulty, right? Which can be crying, it can be having a hard time with managing outbursts, or even coming across as anger. It can be feeling just shut down and numb. So I think you can imagine that if you're a person that may be struggling with self-worth or self-concept, and then you struggle with managing your day-to-day emotions, it can be really easy to go into that cycle of dark self-blame. So me on this side of the screen as the therapist, I can see my clients struggling to regulate emotions and say, wow, that's a symptom of your trauma. But my clients often will say, no, that's something wrong with me. So that's one way I think that we again, we look at that cycle of self-blame. um, the negative self-concept, and you'll hear me say that a lot, because that's really some of the strongest symptoms I think that we see with complex trauma, is the shame, self-blame, and the ability for thoughts to just be so dark and negative, that doesn't often come with a single incident of trauma. um, Difficulty in future relationships is also a symptom of complex trauma. So that can be struggling with not only dating down the line, if that's something somebody wants to do, but family relationships, relationships with children, parents, friendships, people at work, struggling with trust in those relationships. So, again, easy to go down a path of self blame, but also technically a symptom. And then disassociating, which, I think, again, we have some concept of what that is, but that's sort of living your life in a state of separation or numbness, rather than being able to be present, be in the moment, enjoy happiness and the little things. So, all of those are, you have like quote unquote regular PTSD symptoms, you add on those complex trauma symptoms, and it starts to be that overwhelming swell of really complicated, treatable symptoms, but things that people may not identify, because we start to think it's all problems within ourselves and not from a traumatic event or from a relationship.
Yeah, thanks for explaining the difference between post-traumatic stress
Yeah.
disorder and the complex post-traumatic stress disorder,
Sure.
because I think we needed to validate, like, to tell everybody the differences between the two, because they are different. What I want to talk a little bit there, because you talked a lot about blame,
Yeah.
and I go back to my own story, and boy, did I ever blame myself for everything. And that's kind of what seems to be what a lot of us do in this
Mhm.
situation, is going back, we blame ourselves for everything. And is that connected to the shame? Is that what you're saying? How we feel shame, and then is that kind of from all the abuse that we took?
Mhm. Absolutely. I think that if we're looking at sort of traditional abusive relationship cycles, the biggest aspect of how that exists is through that power and control. So, if there is one partner that maintains that power within the relationship, one of the most effective mechanisms of control and abuse is by making the person who's being victimized or will eventually become survivor of that abuse is to make it all their fault, right? Whatever it is that goes wrong becomes all their fault. And someone who is effective in creating an abusive relationship or abusive dynamic can be very effective in convincing the other person that everything that goes wrong in their relationship, with children, with finances, with all aspects becomes their fault. And so, therefore, being able to look at symptoms later on, even once that relationship has ended, and to stop that cycle of self blame, that takes a long time to start to unwind. And it is sometimes people capable of doing that on their own, but very often, because it becomes so internalized and ingrained without therapy and trying to move into a healthier relationship dynamic, friendships, connecting with other people, it's not something we can flip a switch, right? So that's really where I think that abusive relationships, we learn to internalize all of the blame, the shame, the judgment, and keep everything secretive and under wraps so things look good from the outside. And again, flipping that switch and becoming confident in ourselves, it's not impossible, but it's really hard, really hard.
Yeah, let's just talk a bit about how it looks in post separation, because I think the thing is I work with clients as well, and I think a lot of them think, okay, once you get that divorce, you have that naive hope that everything's going to be um fine. But in reality, the abuse continues for some people, just, or it can escalate after, right? So
Mhm.
um if you want to touch down on that a little bit.
Sure. So I think that, there are different types of post separation abuse that we see. I think that often, and this is way back in the day when I worked in the community, people who were coming out of abusive relationships, we would see certain cycles of abuse that we knew were more at risk for physical harm. For example, once a relationship ended, because again, we're breaking a power dynamic, we're taking somebody who's been in control physically and otherwise for sometimes for years, and we're pulling the rug out from under them. And so the reaction can tend to be that they double down and intensify on what it is they're trying to do to regain control. So sometimes it's easier to imagine a little bit in that concept of physical abuse, where if someone is like, punching someone and that they don't get a response, they may punch harder, or punch again, trying to get some person to be hurt or to be harmed. So it's easier, I think, in a way, when we think about it in that way of physical abuse. But when we look at post separation abuse, especially in the context of divorce, that sometimes doubling down or, the abuse continuing, it's just the same. It's just that it looks slightly different. Um, and I think that There are, different kind of categories that falls into. One would be categories where there are children involved, and therefore the children are often involved in the cycles of post-separation abuse. And sometimes when there are no children involved, it can swing slightly different direction, but there's still definitely similarities across those categories. I can jump into some of those, Karen, if you'd like me to.
Yeah, I think the listeners would like to know
Okay.
some of them.
All right. So I think the first would be what we might quantify as legal abuse. And so that can be using the court system or a divorce itself as a tool of manipulation or control. So, for example, if one person is dragging the other one through multiple court appearances, or using, let's say, an attorney that may make the person be triggered in their trauma responses, causing all kinds of emotional disruption. And maybe the other person is missing work as a result, or they're struggling to pay legal fees. The dragging the person back and forth through court, sometimes for years at a time, is still a piece of abuse that can linger long after people are no longer living under the same roof. And I think that looks in different ways in different divorces and separations, and can be worsened if there is, say, property or more finances involved, right? And financial or slash economic abuse, I think, is often closely tied. But there are some distinctions where when we look more under economic abuse, for example, if one person maybe is relying on child support, the other person may choose not to pay it, then that's also a tool of, control or causing harm that can linger long after. Um, that can also fall under spousal support, controlling shared assets. There's all different kinds of ways I think both legal and economic abuse can be incredibly impactful, even if they are not something where you have to see that person every day, um, or whether or not that physical abuse has long since ended. Um, I think there's also kind of what we see as more traditional stalking behavior that can linger long after a relationship has ended. And stalking, of course, can, be threatening to someone's job, be threatening to someone's, sense of safety, of course, ability to begin to grow their life again and make new friendships and new support system and new community. Having someone follow you to the new aspects of your life where you're trying to establish or reestablish safety is just like those claws reaching in from the past to the present. And then when we look, especially that other category, which is a huge one of children, the post separation abuse often comes in, can be with different tools of manipulation in custody cases. It can be, you know, holding children past like their time when they're supposed to be with one parent. It can be making, very negative comments about one parent over another. Um, they're, even using child protective services as a tool of manipulation, abuse, or control. These are all things that are, again, just as impactful and can be much longer lasting than in a relationship in itself.
So I just want to mention because how hard post-divorce abuse is. When I was doing my thanatology degree, Dr. Harris is a world renowned for non-death loss, and she had talked to us in one of our units about, as a thanatologist, we always think that death is the hardest thing, and it is, right? As a thanatologist, okay. However, she did say that for people that are going through extremely high conflict divorces, like
Mm-hmm.
what we're talking about, she, in her professional opinion, would say it's harder than a death loss. because of what you're talking about, the ongoing, it's never ending, it's
Mhm.
years, right? So there's never any, integration is what we call it, right? So it's like
Mhm.
you're always living in, as you said, you're in fear and flight and fawn response because this person is not ever stopping. So I just want to mention that as well.
Mhm. I mean, and I tell clients that, it's like trying to heal from, some sort of like, you know, deathly illness, but while you're still in the emergency room, right? Like we try to heal from trauma once it has concluded and we're able to start inserting in our new healthy coping mechanisms. We know that time and space can be really helpful. Therapy helps, but we just need that time and space and break and ability to, find footing and start a new life again. And when you're being constantly tugged backwards, whether that's tugged back into court, tugged backwards because you are, trying to deal with finances, tugged back and forth because of custody issues, there's not really that break, that separation, ability to have space, time, and healing. It doesn't happen. And so, yes, I work with clients to slowly begin to heal, and it's not impossible, but it is that you're living in an acute situation and trying to start over all at the same time. Um, and with support, it can happen, and people can come out the other side incredibly strong. But that period, especially while you're trying to figure out what life can look like, where you are dealing with, what can be intense post separation abuse, and then trying to go home and reestablish a new life, that's a lot. Um, and especially when, you know, it's something that we don't talk about. So when you're out with friends, people aren't saying like, "Oh, today was a really terrible day," when it came to the post-separation abuse with, CPS being called, falsely, for example. We don't talk about that. So, it's more of that internalization of shame. So the pattern continues and continues while we're still trying to heal and start over at the same time.
I just want to touch down that this we hear with a lot of this with women,
Mhm.
but it does happen to men as well.
Oh, absolutely. Um, and I think that, some of it is, what sort of societal norms are. Some of it is what is reported. A lot of abuse we know is never reported, but I think that as it becomes slightly more acceptable, women are more likely to report. And also sometimes, um, it can just look slightly different depending upon whether or not we're looking at one parent over another. But absolutely, I think it's really important for those of us in mental health, for all of us that work in this field, to be very, very mindful that post separation abuse looks similar and is, incredibly common regardless of the gender, for looking at a father or a mother. Um, and can, I think personally, sometimes can even be more challenging if there is a father maybe who's experiencing the post separation abuse, because the ability sometimes for people who are within the, professionals within the system to be able to see through gender norms may be quite a challenge.
Yeah, I also think of men's culture as, women do seek out more support. They'll seek out you, Sarah. They'll
Mhm.
seek out better support systems. They'll work on it. I think our gender, we just do that, right? Because a lot
Yeah.
of my clients for grief, it's women. I get the odd guy, but it's more women.
Yeah.
But I don't think men, they don't go around and say, oh, my wife is relationship undermining with my children right now. Like they just keep
Yeah.
everything really closed in. And as you said, it's cultural, societal. But they need to be, I just want to bring it up so they can be aware that it can happen to both genders.
I think absolutely. And, you know, um, I think that it's often even in my practice, and I know that, for example, I'm a trauma therapist. People tend to come to me for that. I very, very commonly have women that will show up on their very first day of therapy and say, I am here for this, this, and this trauma. Where I'll have other people that are men very commonly that'll come in and they'll say it's work stress or other things that are maybe more like socially acceptable, let's say. And then maybe 3 sessions in, it all starts to come out. So I would say if you are someone of the male gender and you're not comfortable with, showing up on your first day of therapy or opening up immediately about what you're experiencing, that's okay. Do it when you're ready, but that doesn't mean that you need to skip asking for support altogether.
So I just before we talk about some tips you can give the
Sure.
listeners, what are the long-term effects? Do you know of I know it's autoimmune diseases, but I know it's a big topic, but I just want people to be really um, aware that they should try to get some type of support if they feel they're experiencing complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So, are there long-term effects like for this?
hmm I absolutely. I mean, I think that there are the long-term effects that the individual experiences, um, and then we also I just want to make sure that we touch on the what children who grow up in these environments can also experience. So, for the individual who is experiencing the complex PTSD, we really look at what can be like long term, like deep seated depression can be something that can be hard to balance. So it may not be right. Like people can have more than one diagnosis. So it's enough in itself, right, to be battling CPTSD. But when it's not treated, depression can absolutely set in, poor self worth, which echoes to all aspects of life. It's not just about being comfortable with the way you look in the mirror, but it's being comfortable with the ability to interview for jobs, to make new friendships, to start new relationships, to connect outside of a situation with an abuser, right? So when we talk about poor self worth and poor self concept, when it comes from trauma, that is pretty deep and pretty dark. Having persistent anxiety, it can lead to things like chronic pain, and other sorts of physical health issues that echo down the line. So it often transitions from more of an acute phase of trauma to this complex trauma, the way that you feel about yourself, your life, and how long the symptoms persist, and then how that just echoes through all the different areas of your social functioning. So, we would hope that people seek treatment earlier on for better outcomes. It doesn't mean that it's not worth getting help if it has been some years, but it's definitely, um, let's say, maybe easier to treat to some extent when it's earlier on. Um, then, when we look at what happens to kids when they grow up in households that way, one of the ways that we measure that is through what we call an ACE score, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experience Survey. And that looks at what are the physical health symptoms that kids who grow up in abusive environments can experience as adults. And so it's just a little survey, and it can show that when kids grow up in homes where there is divorce or abuse or substance abuse, and let me throw that one in there for the person that's a survivor as well, substance abuse and other poor coping mechanisms is also something that can happen if it goes untreated. So I'm sorry, I want to make sure I throw that in there. Um, but kids that grow up in these environments, we also know that over time they have much higher likelihoods of things like heart disease, um, earlier onset of different other types of illness, substance use, and then even the sorts of attachment issues that can create um, intergenerational trauma. So it's not something that's untreatable, but left untreated and unaddressed. Want to make sure that we're not passing down these dysfunctional sorts of power dynamics to kids. And the best way to do that is to take care of ourselves and make sure that, regardless of the level of abuse that we're experiencing or have experienced, or continue to experience if it's post separation abuse, that we gain tools of how to communicate and create the healthiest home possible. So that way that abuse cycle stops and it doesn't get passed on to the next generation.
Yeah, that's very, very important. Um, Considering I grew up in a high conflict home, my
Okay.
parents didn't know any better. Um, so it's very important that parents start looking after themselves and then put the air mask, put the airplane on their kids and get them help
Absolutely.
because we want the cycle to stop, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the most important thing. So what are some like simple tips or something you can give somebody that they can just do themselves or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, to just help them along?
Yeah. Um, I would say, you know, if someone is in an abusive relationship, of course, prioritize safety, safety first. If you don't know what that looks like, National Domestic Violence Hotline, you can get a human being on the phone, on chat, anytime, any place, anywhere, and they can just help you with cycling through some processes to make sure that you've got a safe exit strategy. And that would be the same as if you're experiencing certain types of post separation abuse. Make sure that you always have a safety plan, a safe exit, um, and even having, cash or an extra cell phone, a friend that knows what you're going through. Safety first. That sometimes seems like that should be default, but if we've lived a long period of life in fight or flight, prioritizing simple safety sometimes can be easily overlooked. So I always want to kind of point out what may feel a little bit like obvious, but is often not if you've lived in a traumatic home. Other things that we can do for ourselves are to find, I always like to say, making giant life shifts can be a lot. So, starting with moments, right? So, trying to find a moment during the day where you start to prioritize self care. And that doesn't have to be investing in anything expensive, it can be 3 minutes of mindful breathing from a free app on your phone, right? Things you can do that can start to calm your nervous system. Doesn't mean that it has to be expensive. And it doesn't even mean that you have to go to therapy every week. Anything you can do, taking a walk, doing some exercise, doing some mindful breathing, it will still start to regulate your nervous system, bring down out of fight or flight, help with anxiety, help with depressive symptoms. So, those little tiny things can add up over time and can be a great start. And then, of course, going to therapy, I think, is beneficial in that you can figure out what are the symptoms that you're experiencing that can be attributed to trauma, understanding how that impacts you now, help unravel that cycle of self-blame, self-hatred, and learn to find aspects of yourself that you like. And then the really, exciting part after you've moved past those stages in therapy will be with your therapist or with a support system, is to be able to look forward and figure out what are the pieces of life that you'd like to put together now that you're not living in an abusive relationship. And, you know, sometimes it can be really, really hard to look forward when you're busy in an abusive cycle, whether it's an abusive relationship or post separation abuse. So that's okay. You don't need to know what the future looks like. I think just to know that, as simple as moments of self care and getting some support from a therapist and connecting with your own support system, friend, family, if you have one, Some people don't. Isolation is common in abusive relationships, but seeking a professional, if you don't have your own support system, you'll start to be able to recognize the patterns. And that really can take away a lot of that power and control dynamic that people have lived in for a long time.
Yeah, those are great. So, is there anything you'd like to say before I ask the last question? Did we miss anything?
I think we touched on a lot.
We did.
I just think, like everything else that, and I'm glad that you bring this issue. Again, the biggest thing I think that perpetuates these cycles from, not stopping is that we don't talk about it enough. So I would say, like, you know, if you have even a friend or a family member and you suspect something, don't push, don't shove to try to get information, but just to allow that person to know you're safe and you're supportive and you're there, and to open, just crack a door. If you know someone in your life or you suspect abuse, um, it's not going to, cause harm or damage to just be there and be a friend and be non-judgmental. So I would say let's just, as people, as professionals, as society, I think the more we can talk about this, the better. So thank you. That's the message. And again, thanks for doing that.
So, I ask everybody who comes on, for someone who's just separated, whether they left or were left, what advice would you give them to help them navigate those overwhelming early days?
Um, I would say, first off, is to feel your feelings, right? So if you need to cry, cry. If you feel like you need to scream into a pillow, do it. It's going to be very realistically an overwhelming swirl of emotions, and it won't be pleasant. For some people, it can be freeing. I don't see that all that often. Most often, I see what feels like sadness that's never going to lift. So remind yourself that it's going to be temporary, right? That this is the hardest time, and reminding, whether you believe it or not, that self talk will slowly stick. So it's that fake it till you make it moment. Um, there is definitely validity in that in mental health. So stay strong. And usually the first little while is the worst, as far as the emotions go. And that with the right support, life can look very, very different. Life can look better. It's just really hard to see that in the beginning. So just one of those, one day at a time may seem too long. So one moment at a time, is usually a place to start that's realistic.
I just love what you said, self-talk sticks, right? Negative self-talk sticks. I think I'm going to use that as well, right? Because we all do it, right?
Oh,
So,
totally.
yeah. Anyways, I
Trauma
love.
survivors we can be so dark and so defeating. So yeah, the self-talk is, I ask my clients, what is it that you tell yourself inside your mind? What are those voices saying to you? And man, it can be dark, and sometimes even just saying it out loud, it's like, please don't talk to yourself that way.
Mhm, mhm.
um so sometimes it seems very much like simple advice coming from a third party. So even saying it out loud and thinking to yourself, would you ever speak to anyone but yourself that way? If not, probably not a good thing to do.
Yeah. So where can people get in touch with you? And I know you're based in San Francisco. Do you
Sure.
do um, therapy just in California, or can you do other states, or can you come up to Canada? Like what is your?
Sure. Thank you for asking. So I different things. I provide therapy. I have an office right in San Francisco. So if people want to come in real life, that's where I'm located. I see clients through telehealth anywhere in the state of California. Provide education anywhere and do consulting or coaching anywhere as well. So I'm found different ways. The easiest way to get in touch with me is through my website, which is just sarasanfordtherapy.com. Send me a message or an email, and I'm always happy to chat and see if I can be of support.
Thank you, Sarah. The work you're doing is so necessary, right? There are so many survivors and people that are in it now. And I
Mhm.
think what you said before, that we are both passionate about helping people, and I think this is something that needs to get talked about more, because
Absolutely.
I suspect there's a lot of people walking around this world that are
Mhm.
suffering with this, and they're on antidepressants, they're on whatever they're doing, but not really working on the big trauma piece of it all. So thank
Absolutely.
you for coming on.
Karen.
You're so informative and such wealth of knowledge. So I appreciate you coming on to the Just Separated podcast.
Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate the opportunity and for you having this platform. So, again, it starts to become something that is not going to be under the surface for too much longer, hopefully.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's discussion with our divorce expert. Check out the show notes for more about our guest. If you're finding value in our podcast, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our YouTube channel at Divorce Workshop. Share your questions, comments, or guest suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. For a comprehensive divorce guide, check out our Just Separated workbook on Amazon worldwide. This workbook covers everything from emotions and co-parenting to finances, legal insights, and recovery, a must-have for anyone navigating separation or divorce.